Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is a brief wrap-up for OctPOEber of 2025. So OctPOEber was an event in October that celebrated Edgar Allan Poe, an author that certainly had a big effect on me becoming a reader in life and somebody who loved books. And I read a story from this one, which I'll get to in just a second, from this edition. But essentially, OctPOEber, there were 4 prompts that were created by Greg from Another Bibliophile Reads. One of my co-hosts, he and the other co-host, Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics, they were kind enough to have me along for the ride this year. And I did manage to complete all of the prompts. There were 4 of them, so it wasn't too bad. But really, it was a really busy month. That's why I haven't really made videos in about a month. But I have been active, so it's mostly been a good kind of busy. But I figured I'd take advantage of a really nice day today and come out onto my porch and tell you what I did for the prompts. So to begin with, the first prompt was read a poem or poems by Poe. What I ended up reading was The Conqueror Worm, a fairly short poem. I can't speak today. Short poem about the kind of grim reality of, life being very brief and temporary, and eventually we all become meal for worms. It's one of my personal favorites. I don't think that Poe was necessarily the strongest when it comes to poetry. I think his prose was a lot better, but that is one of my favorites. For a short story, I read one of the shortest stories, actually, and that's A Telltale Heart. And I read it out of this edition that has terrific illustrations by Harry Clark. And let's see if I can find that. The Telltale Heart image really quickly. And I think everybody knows this story. You have a tale of murder told by the murderer. Get the victim there underneath the rug. And essentially this guy who kills an old man an old neighbor, because he's convinced that his eye that's like a vulture is essentially evil. And after he's hidden the evidence, he's convinced that he hears the beating of the heart of the victim beneath the floorboards and ends up giving himself up. So there's a lot of really great themes inside this story. One thing like kind of self-destruction, being your own worst enemy, but it's also an early example of an unreliable narrator. And I like how Poe, this is way before psychology, really seemed to understand that madness had its own logic. I remember finding this out as a teenager. We have, just a few towns over, we had a mental asylum that a few decades ago the state closed up. And they basically didn't want to pay for it anymore, and they let the patients out. And there was this one guy who used to hang out in a parking lot at in a chain store in the area. And as a teenager, we would hear his stories. And he was schizophrenic, and he had been at this mental asylum. And he would talk about how there was like a vast conspiracy, and there were upside down underground pyramids, and the post office was involved, and there were angels with sunglasses on. In his mind, it all made sense. Of course, he had his own logic, even if we knew that it was absolutely bonkers. It was the first indication that madness is not random, that it has its own logic, and I think Poe really understood that in that story. The next prompt was to read or watch something inspired by Poe. I've watched most things inspired by Poe or adapted from Poe. So what I decided to do this year was to do watch one of the few things that I haven't watched. About 15 years ago, when I was still writing for my horror movie blog, the Revenant Review, I kind of had this personal project where I went through silent horror, and I tried to watch every silent horror film that I could get my hands on. And I wrote kind of essays/reviews for each of them. And one of the ones that at the time I really wasn't able to find a good copy of, or if I could find a copy, it wasn't in English because it's French, and that would be the 1928 version of The Fall of the House of Usher by Jean Epstein. And now we have plenty of copies, both in English and in French, that are readily available. So I decided to watch one of those. I found a decent copy on YouTube. I actually watched a little bit of the French and the English. I've been kind of teaching myself French over the past almost 2 years, not in a really studious way, in a very, kind of a little bit here and there each day, but I was able to understand most of the intertitles, which was nice. And this certainly had a very positive reputation. The story, it makes a few changes from the actual tale. Like Roderick, it's his wife in the movie, not his sister, who basically gets buried alive. But they don't do a lot to change the story. I will say that it is a slow-moving story, and that's even for silent films. I've seen a lot of silent films and a lot of silent horror, and this one I was kind of watching the clock a little bit. It stretches that short story out as long as it can, but when it hits, it does have this kind of dreamlike quality that I thought was really commendable, and a lot of interesting editing tricks that it uses. So I think that if you're into that sort of thing, into silent film, silent horror, I think it's worth checking out. Although, maybe like me, you find yourself running out of a little bit of patience here and there for wanting to, move a little bit faster. Again, I don't know if that's just my modern sensibility, but like I said, I've seen a lot of silent films, so I'm not new to the genre, or I'm not new to the medium. And I just found this one to be a little bit slow, but still glad I watched it. And the last prompt was visit a ghostly or haunted site in your location. And every year, my family and I go to this really good haunted trail. It's been going on for at least 10 years now. You park in the community center area, parking lot in town, and then they bus you over to the location. You get off the bus and you get on a tractor, which takes you kind of this haunted hayride to the entrance to the trail. And then the trail itself is about like 30 to 45 minutes, and there's usually at least 2 to 3 really good set pieces in there. It's a nice mixture of horror and kind of real fun. And we had a great time with it. We do every year, and that's what we ended up doing for this last prompt. So that's it. That's what I did for OctPOEber of 2025. If you've read anything or done anything for OctPOEber, I'd love to hear what you did. And thanks again to Greg and Alan for having me along. And as always, thank you, BookTube.